Let's get into this message. Here's what I'm titling this sermon. It's called The Anatomy of an Argument. The Anatomy of an Argument. You know, I thought that I was great at relationships until I got married. Now, if you're married, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I thought I was really good at relationships. Now, I've shared a little bit about, my family history. I grew up with incredible parents. And though I lost my dad when I was 11 years old, I really got to watch my parents in an extremely healthy marriage. My parents both walked with the Lord, had committed relationships with Jesus, and they really were incredible parents. They modeled an amazing marriage to me. So I got to watch that growing up. Unity in the household, biblical values, and really had an incredible marriage that I got to glean from. But after I lost my dad, my mom remarried to an incredible man of God, and they have an incredible marriage as well. The cool thing about their marriage is they've really both been through everything you could possibly be through in a family dynamic. It's crazy. They have so much experience that they actually spend their time now doing marriage counseling. And so they counsel other couples in the church, and it's just an incredible thing. My wife and I actually got to do our premarital counseling with them, and it's just been such a cool resource for us in our marriage, in our relationship, to have them as mentors in our lives. And so I've been able to really see healthy relationships. I've been surrounded by great resources, and so I had a lot of confidence headed into marriage. And we started in our dating time of learning how to have conflict and learning how to have conversations, but there's just something that changes when you get married, when you start to live with each other and you're in each other's space, and it's like, you used to be able to go home after the day was over, and then you would miss each other and you're like, let's FaceTime until we fall asleep. And now it's like, it's a totally different situation. And so, we got married, and throughout that time, our conversation started to change, and conflict even started to change. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I don't run away from conflict. I tend to run to it because I believe conflict builds connection. But as we started to grow in our marriage, the conflict started to change. And I started to notice that your spouse can bring out a side of you that you didn't even know existed. Come on, married people, I'm talking to you right now. There's a level of anger that your spouse can bring out in you that literally it scares you. You're like, who is this person? And where were they hiding? And then you just want to blame it on your spouse. Like, you did this to me. You're bringing this monster out. But after the argument is over, you're just kind of left there looking and evaluating yourself, realizing, yikes, there's some scary stuff in me that I didn't know was in there. Now, thank God for marriage, right? Because marriage, although God gave it to us to create a happy and healthy life, the primary goal of marriage is not to make you happy, it's to make you holy. It's to reveal things in you that you would never have revealed outside of that covenant relationship, right? Like, we can all feel great about ourselves in our prayer closets, hanging out with God, nobody around, got our coffee on, Hillsong worship in the background. Like, I'm a great Christian there. But put me in a room in quarantine that I can't leave with my spouse for a year straight, and I'm gonna tell you, there are gonna be some things that are coming out of me that I didn't even know existed in there. And that's exactly what marriage is all about. That's really what relationships are all about. If you read scripture, the majority of what God is trying to do in and through us only happens within the context of community. That's why it's so important that you go to church with people, that you have a watch party and an e-group that you're a part of, because it's one thing to do life with God alone. It's another thing to do life with God with other people. And so marriage and relationship has a funny way of revealing and exposing some things in us that we never would have seen without another person. That ultimately leads to conflict. Now, the moment I say that word, I know some of you freak out. Others of you feel like you're ready to go. But the truth of the matter is, conflict is a normal part of relationships. And before I get into this, I really want to dispel a few myths about conflict that I think we tend to believe when we're new in relationships, or if we've been in a relationship for a long time and conflict tends to be difficult. We start to buy into some lies about conflict, and I want to dispel a few of these myths today. Here's a few lies that we need to break when it comes to conflict. Here's one: all conflict is bad. That's just not true. In fact, conflict can be extremely beneficial in helping us grow in intimacy. Here's another lie: conflict is a sign of a relationship that won't work out. Just not true. I have people come to me all the time and say, Pastor, it just feels like it shouldn't be this hard. And I always give them the same response. If you've ever heard me preach, you've heard me say this before. I always have the same response. I said, who said that? Like, where did you get that idea? Because that's just not true. Here's another lie: conflict has to lead to chaos, distance, or disconnection. That's just not true either. Conflict doesn't have to lead to a state of disconnection. In fact, it can lead to intimacy. Here's a few other lies we believe about conflict: a healthy relationship shouldn't be this hard, or personality conflicts just can't be solved. Some people are just more naturally able to solve conflict. Look, I know there are some of us that feel like we enjoy conflict, but even those of us who are more prone to conflict than others still struggle when it's conflict that affects us negatively. So that's just not true. And lastly, conflict is the enemy of harmony. For those of us who hate conflict, it's probably because we really value harmony, where everything is peaceful. But the Bible says, blessed are the peacemakers, not peacekeepers. And sometimes in our attempts to keep harmony in our household or harmony in our relationships, we're actually neglecting some issues that need to be resolved. So today I want to talk about the anatomy of an argument. And over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be teaching you about what it looks like to understand how to do healthy conflict. And before we talk about that, I need you to know that conflict is a normal part of healthy relationships. The question is, do you have the right perspective entering into that conflict? You see, if we're in the conflict to get something, chances are that we are always going to be frustrated when we enter into an argument. But if we enter in with the perspective not of getting something, but of growing something, then conflict becomes a necessary part in connecting with our significant others. I say it like this: conflict within relationships is constructive when both people are committed to a greater purpose. When we are both committed to the purpose, then conflict is constructive in our relationship. But here's the problem. Many of us don't have that perspective. Look at what Scripture constantly tells us about what our goal needs to be within relationships. Now, these scriptures are talking specifically about our relationships within the church, but you need to understand that this also speaks of our relationship with our spouses, with our family members, with our friends. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 2 through 3, look at what it says. The writer says, "Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love." This is what we need to hear right now in our nation, on social media and in the midst of our differences, because right now everybody is all promoting this idea. You just need to say something. Make a statement, Pastor. People get frustrated at me sometimes because I'm not quick to speak when things happen. But I've learned this, that wisdom waits. Wisdom is slow to speak and quick to listen, quick to hear the voice of God. Why? Because the goal is not about making a statement. The goal is about bridging the gap to build unity. Look at what he says in Ephesians 4, verse 3. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. We lack this in our culture today. We lack the value of doing everything in our power to build unity through the bond of peace. Yet this is what the Bible tells us must be our priority and our goal within our relationships. Look at this in 1 Corinthians 1:10. Paul says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, for the sake of the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to agree to live in unity with one another and put to rest any division that attempts to tear you apart. Be restored as one united body living in perfect harmony. Form a consistent choreography among yourselves, having a common perspective with shared values. You see, conflict is a normal, healthy part of relationships. We are different, unique individuals. So when we get together, chances are we're going to see things differently. Conflict is constructive when our purpose, when our eyes are set on the goal of unity. But conflict within a relationship is destructive when both people are more committed to their preferences than they are to the purpose. And in marriage and in relationships, I think we all fall into this trap of being more committed to our preferences than we are of the greater purpose of being unified. I would rather just be right and have my way than actually building the bridge of connection in unity. And so we have to ask the question, what is our perspective headed into conflict? And so let me explain. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of an argument. We're going to be breaking down what happens within conflict. And so this week, we'll be discussing how we can understand the cause of conflict. How do we get into conflict and why? But next week, we'll be adjusting the course of conflict. How can we do conflict well? So I'm asking that if you're tuning in right now to stay with us for the next 2 weeks because you can't have one message without the other. Today, we're going to take a higher level look at why we get into conflict, what motivates us to argue, and how can we identify the factors and the triggers that lead to this conflict within our relationship. But next week, we'll be setting the course on how we can do conflict well and how we can do it in a healthy way. But we've got to ask ourselves, what's our perspective when we come into conflict? If you're married right now and you're struggling with arguments, if you're fighting all the time, if you're engaging in conflict, ask this question before we deal with anything else. What's your perspective in headed into conflict? Is it for the purpose of unity, to build the connection, to learn more about your spouse, to grow and to sanctify yourself, to become more like Christ? Or is it to value your preferences, to get your way, to feel comfortable, to have things done the way you want them to be done? We need to understand the anatomy of an argument. And understanding always begins with origins. And so if we're on a timeline of conflict today, we're beginning all the way at the start, and understanding the anatomy of an argument will always begin with origins. Origins are how our past experiences have developed us over time. I remember this was years and years ago. I was still in college, and I went home for Christmas break, and as I was hanging out at the dinner table with some of my family and friends, there was somebody over that had been in practice with my dad. My dad was a physical therapist when he was alive, and so we had this family friend over, and we were catching up and talking and reminiscing of good stories and memories from the past. And as I was sharing about some of the things that were happening in my life at college and what I was learning and in my studies, I was watching this friend of my dad's sitting there listening to me, and he began to have tears stream down his face. And I thought he was just getting really excited about my stories, but over time, he as he was listening to me, he looked at me and he said, "Man, you just sound so much like your dad." And it was crazy to me because I really hadn't spent much time listening to my dad to be able to mimic or model what I'd seen. I lost my dad when I was 11. And so although I had seen him and heard him, I wasn't practicing what I had watched him do. This was years and years later. There was something about his DNA that was now in me that was being expressed through my life. You see, my origins were now being expressed through my communication, through my actions. And somebody that had known my dad was now looking at me saying, "Man, you sound just like your dad." The truth is, we all have origins because we come from somewhere and somebody. You have parents that passed on DNA to you, preferences and personality traits and different things about who you are. But it's not just what you were given internally, it was the environment you were surrounded by. It's that age-old argument of nature versus nurture. Were you born with these personality traits or were you developed over time? And I really believe that it's a mixture of the two. I really believe that we often mimic what we're made up of and what was modeled. It's not either or, it's both and. We often mimic what we're made up of and what was modeled to us. And so the question we have to ask ourselves in understanding our origins is, what were the environments that I grew up around? What were significant experiences that I had that shaped my personality and developed me as a human being? What are the origins that have developed who I am today? You see, the more we understand our origins, the more we can address them and understand how they affect us. Have you really ever taken enough time to evaluate your origins? To sit there and think about where you came from? Some of us, we don't want to do this because for us to evaluate where we came from, it's scary. It's intimidating. We don't want to go back there. But for us to understand why we have conflict or to understand the basis of arguments in our relationships, we've got to take time to evaluate where we come from. Did you grow up with plenty or never enough? How stable was your parents' relationship? When you looked at them, was it constantly on the rocks or was there stability and security? Did you see and experience healthy affection as a child? Was your home a safe place or a place of warfare? Some of us, we grew up in a home where there was constant arguments, constant fighting and conflict. Was there regular connection or only specific times within relationships? Maybe the only time you ever deeply connected with people in your family was after conflict. And you wonder why you rush to conflict. Maybe it's an origin that developed you as a person. Did conversations around sex and sexuality carry shame? So now in your life, that's an area of shame and guilt. You see, origins develop an exploration in all of us. The way we were developed and grown, the environments, the experience that we had, these origins develop an exploration in all of us. We're all searching for something. In a significant other, in a marriage, in friendships, in a church community, we're all looking for something. That exploration comes from where we were raised and how we were raised. It's either an exploration for what we received and want to repeat in our lives, or it's an exploration for what we lacked and we're now looking for. This is so important. Today, I know we're going to be dealing with some psychology and we're going to get into our minds a little bit, but it's so important that you take time to ask these questions because all of us are looking for something. Either we're looking for what we were given and want to continue seeing in our lives, or what we were never given and what we're longing for so deeply. And I know what you're thinking. I grew up in chaos, Pastor Jared. I grew up with abusive parents. I grew up in a hectic household, and I don't even want to go back to thinking about that. I grew up seeing addiction and dysfunction, and I'm seeing it play out in my life, and I want you to hear me. It's important to evaluate the origins, but your origins do not have to define you. They can either develop you or define you, but it's your decision. And I came to encourage somebody who's feeling like they are trapped as a prisoner to their past experiences, to their parents. You are not powerless. You have been given power to make changes in your life. Look at what the scripture says in Romans 12. It says, do not be conformed to the likeness of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You see, this is so important. And I know this teaching is going to be a bit different for many of us because it's not as based out of a Bible story. It's bits and pieces. But it's so important for us to understand that transformation comes from addressing what's happening in here. Renewing our mind. And I came to encourage somebody, you have the power to transform who you are today. You are not trapped in past experiences and mistakes that your mom and your dad made. You have the power to make changes in your life, but it's important that we evaluate where we come from. So here are a few questions to ask when you're in an argument. Number one, what from my past is shaping my perspective? This is so vital for every person to be able to recognize where they come from and how where they come from shapes their perspective. We all have a bias in our lives. That bias is built upon the culture, the environments, the relationship that we had. So what from your past is shaping your perspective? Is it instability? Is it intimacy? Is it a fear of failure? Is it a need for approval? The origins in your life give you hints for what it is that your perspective has been shaped to see. A second question for you to ask is, were my origins healthy or harmful? This is where we need to get really honest about whether we grew up in a constructive environment or a destructive environment. You know what we tend to do when we reminisce about unhealthy experiences that we had in the past? When we're older, we kind of laugh it off, right? We just make jokes about it. But you have to ask the question, was that a healthy environment or an unhealthy environment? Were the things that my parents said and did really biblical and building me towards what God was calling me to be, or were they breaking me down and I'm laughing about it now, but really what if I don't address it, I'm going to repeat it in my own parenting relationship with my children? And lastly, you have to ask, have I allowed my origins to define me instead of develop me? You see, I'm all about the Myers-Briggs personality test. I love strength finders. I love the Enneagram. I love all these things because I love learning about myself. But here's the problem. Sometimes we use those things as an excuse to just say, this is who I am, just deal with it. And we define ourselves based on our personalities, but we never allow God to develop our personalities to become like Christ. Ultimately, you learn about who you are so you can become more like Christ, so that you can remove the hindrances that are getting in the way of becoming more like Jesus. Origins are important to evaluate, but origins ultimately lead to foundations. That's the second thing we need to address in the anatomy of an argument. Foundations are how you developed based off of those past experiences. So your origins are your past experiences, environments, things that you couldn't control. But your foundations are the values, the convictions, the beliefs, and the behaviors that you defined because of those past experiences. And so for me, right, I grew up in a household with a mother who was obsessive about cleaning everything all the time, right? There was never a day that there wasn't a vacuum out, a mop on the floor, or we were scrubbing something. This is just how my household was. We didn't leave dishes in the sink. It was in the dishwasher before we all went to bed. And based on this environment that I grew up around, I developed certain values and certain convictions about how my house should look when I grew up. And so the things, the beliefs that I have, the foundations that I've laid are heavily influenced by the experiences that I grew up with, the relationships that I had, the connections that I built. I want you to think about it like this. If origins represent the plot of land that we were given, that we couldn't control, this is just, here's the land that you're going to build on, then foundations represent the structure that we build upon that land. And so these represent the values, the most important things to us, right? Convictions. These are important beliefs that we have about God, people, the world around us, our worldview, behaviors. This is a lifestyle that we live to promote our values and convictions. Foundations, they're all about building a future. We have these experiences and these origins, but based on those origins, we build foundations to eventually lead us to the future that we're expecting to experience in our lives. But foundations are not just for ourselves. They're for identifying the type of relationships that we want to engage in that will help lead us to that future. Now, there's really three types of relationships. I'm sure there's more. I broke them down to three that would fit in to our foundations and how we evaluate relationships based on the values and convictions that we've developed over time. There's optimal relationships, right? These are the ones that are on par with our foundations. We have the same preferences. We're going in the same direction. This is ideal, and our connection is comfortable. There's acceptable relationships. This is somewhat challenging, but it still facilitates our values and our preferences, and it keeps connection possible. It's not necessarily comfortable, but it's definitely possible. But then there are unacceptable relationships. Based on our foundations, these relationships fight against our preferences. They're the antithesis of our values and our convictions, and it really makes connection difficult. And so in evaluating relationships in our lives, we start breaking down whether this is optimal, acceptable, or unacceptable. It's easy for many of us to dismiss the unacceptable relationships because that just doesn't feel good. But most of us, we kind of live in the middle because people tend to be different from us, not so different that it's unacceptable, but not so similar where it's optimal. So we kind of live in this acceptable world. Evaluating based on our foundations, here's what happens. When our foundations determine our focus, which that's what they do, foundations in our lives determine our focus on the future. It's that focus that will move us forward towards optimal relationships. Now, here's what I need you to understand about optimal relationships. Optimal doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most constructive. It usually means that it's the most comfortable. We're all looking for the most comfortable relationship where it feels right? Have you ever said that before? It just felt right. We clicked because that's what we're looking for based on our foundations, right? And that's different for every person. For you, it may look like a stable, drama-free marriage. That's really important to you. That's a foundation in your life. I want to make sure it's a stable relationship, drama-free. That's important to me. Maybe it's that your foundation of marriage is that marriage is for life. Divorce is not an option. I grew up around this. And so because of that, I'm looking for somebody with the same foundation that's going to be in this thing forever. Maybe it's committed Christian convictions or a place of passionate debate. You want somebody who's going to voice their opinion, even if that opinion is different than yours. Maybe you have foundations built on specific gender roles. Based on what you saw your parents do, you expect when you get married that the wife is gonna stay home with the kids and you're gonna go out and work, or that both people are gonna work. But these are foundations that you develop based on your origins. And it's important that you address them and evaluate them. And so we have these foundations in our lives. And here's what I've noticed about when we get into an argument. When we get into an argument with a significant other, it's usually attached to an action or an attitude or something that that person does that offends or hurts us. But it's not really the action that gets us so upset. It's that that action represents a foundation that we fear is in disagreement. Have you ever had a conversation within your relationship, or somebody did something that just made you so much more upset than you thought it should? Maybe looking at it, like you step back and you're like, why am I really so upset about this? And it's because it's usually not having anything to do simply with the action itself. It's that the action represents an assault on a foundational value that you hold dear. And internally, now you're afraid, oh my gosh, do they not care as much about this as I do? Do they not value this in our marriage as much as I do? Do they not understand me, right? Like they might not have finished the chores, and you're upset about that. But really, it's eating at a foundation of partnership that you value so dear. You're mad because they didn't do the dishes, but really what it's getting at internally is, oh my gosh, do they not see themselves as an equal partner in this relationship? Do they not care about the things that I care about? They might have said something that hurts you, but it's not just what they said that hurts you, it's eating at a foundation of respect. How could they say what they said if they really respect me? And because respect is such a deep foundation in my life, I can't even imagine that if somebody really respected me, they would allow something like that to come out of their mouth. They might have spent money on something silly. It's not really that big of a deal. But it's not the thing that they spent money on that bothers you. It's the fact that there's a foundation of financial insecurity that you have, that you're afraid that you're gonna lose control. And if somebody spends money that you don't know about, you start freaking out, not because it was $3.57, but it's because you didn't know about it. And if you don't know about it, God forbid, you're gonna lose control of your finances. We gotta ask ourselves, what foundations are under fire when we get into the argument? And identifying these foundations keeps us from simply addressing behaviors that we don't like. And we can start communicating the values that we seem to be in disagreement over. So here are a few questions for you to ask in an argument. What foundation is under fire right now? There's always an issue behind the issue. There's always something deeper going on than what you're dealing with at face value. And if I just settle for arguing over actions, then I'm gonna miss the foundational issue that really scares me. Another question I ask is, what high value of mine is being undervalued by them? This is really important because so many arguments, so much conflict happens because I feel like I have a high value on this and you have a low value on this. And so whatever you're doing is communicating that we don't have the same value system. That's scary within a marriage. That causes us to overreact sometimes because we feel like, oh my gosh, it's not about the dishes. This is about something so much deeper. And we need to address what's going on internally. Last question you have to ask about is, are we dancing around it or are we dealing with it? Do we keep dancing around the issue or are we really addressing what's going on? These foundations are so important to understand about yourself. But these foundations ultimately create expectations. Expectations are how we align the external world around us with our internal world of what we see as optimal. I kind of like to say it like this. If if our foundations are the thoughts and ideas in our heads, expectation is the language in which we communicate those ideals. Expectations are how we align what's happening out here with what we are expecting to live in here. So growing up, my mom always, whenever she cooked, she always had 3 things on the dinner menu. There was always a protein, a starch, and a vegetable. It's just how I grew up, right? Every single meal had those 3 options. There was a protein, chicken, steak, or pork. There was a starch, potatoes, rice, macaroni, and there was vegetables, green beans, carrots, whatever. That was every meal. So because of that, because that was where I came from, and it became what I valued as this is what dinner looks like, whenever I would go over to a friend's house, I expected that they would have these things on the menu. And when they didn't have these things on the menu, I freaked out because I was like, this isn't really dinner. You're not serving me what is really dinner. Where's the vegetables? Where's the starch? Where's the protein? And there was definitely never enough food. And so I freaked out because these foundations and these origins created expectations. My expectations were a way of communicating to the world around me what I expect to live in my ideal and optimal worldview. You see, our expectations are how we direct and align external circumstances with internal foundations. It's how we connect the two so that there's harmony between our ideal and what is out of our control. That's really important to understand. Expectations is how we align what is our ideal, our optimal situation, and what is out of our control. Expectations, no matter who you are, you're gonna have them. It doesn't matter whether you have a lot of them or less. Every single person in a relationship has expectations. And I think sometimes expectations get a bad rap. But here's the truth. Expectations aren't evil. They just need to be evaluated. Because if we don't evaluate the expectation, we can't communicate them, and we can't address them to figure out if they're healthy or unhealthy. So today, I wanna ask you to evaluate your expectations. What are you expecting out of a relationship based upon your origins and foundations? Do you expect a consistent and unwavering partner? Somebody that is always there no matter what, because you came from that, that's what you saw, or you didn't have that, so that's what you expect and what you're looking for in a significant other. Do you expect somebody who's passionate and on fire for God? Come on, ladies, maybe your dad was a pastor or a leader in the church and you just saw him so passionate and on fire for God, and so you expect that the man that you're gonna be with is gonna carry that same level of passion. It's an expectation built on a foundation. Do you expect an opinionated and dogmatic person or a flexible and permissive person? Do you expect somebody to fulfill a specific role, to meet your needs, to react a certain way, to communicate a certain way? You need to take some time to evaluate your expectations. And when you understand origins and foundations, it can become easier to differentiate your expectations and whether they're healthy or unhealthy. Now, here's the thing. Expectations often lead to conflict because we are unique individuals coming from different origins. We're just different. And so because we're different and we expect different things out of different people, chances are the majority of our conflicts and our arguments are coming from expectations. Expectations that are not being met by the person that we expect to meet all of those expectations. And there are really 3 types of unhealthy expectations that you need to watch out for within a relationship. The first are unrealistic expectations. Some of us, especially those of you who are newly married or in a new relationship, we struggle with unrealistic expectations. These can be ungodly expectations of a spouse, unsanctified expectations of a spouse, impossible expectations of outrageous expectations. There are unrealistic expectations that we all have. We all expect our significant other to just be Superman and to meet all of our needs and to do everything the way that we expect them to do. And this is an example of an unhealthy expectation in your life. Unrealistic expectations will lead to conflict because your significant other is not God. And you can't expect them to be God. The second type of unhealthy expectations are unspoken expectations. These are assumptions that we have that lead to disappointment. That I expect you to meet this need or to do this activity or to believe this way or to have this conviction. I assume that you're going to do that because you love me, but I never told you. That's an expectation I have. That's a setup for failure. Most of our conflicts come from unspoken expectations. Things that we are anticipating out of our significant other, but we haven't communicated. And listen to me, if you're in a marriage, if you're in any type of relationship, if you're a leader, if you're in any type of friendship, you cannot hold people accountable to something that you have not communicated. So we've got to be aware of unspoken expectations. The third type of unhealthy expectations are unrecognized expectations. These are expectations that somebody refuses to value and notice in our lives. I put it out there, but they've just been ignored over and over again. Or somebody has shared with me what they expect, but I just keep shutting them down over and over. I just don't listen. I'm dismissing over and over. And what this leads to, it leads to disappointment. It leads to a distrust in a relationship. And ultimately, it leads to disconnection. Unrealistic expectations, unspoken expectations, unrecognized expectations all lead to unmet expectations. And that's what leads to conflict, right? When the person that I'm hoping will meet my needs, I'm hoping will listen in this way, doesn't meet my expectations. And I need you to hear me because this is so important. Expectations in themselves are not evil. But I've learned this within marriage, I've learned this within leading people, that expectations can either be advisors in my relationship or they can be idols in my relationship. Either my expectations can advise my connection with somebody, advise them about who I am, the foundations and the values that I have, can advise how we can move forward in unity and harmony, or they can be idols in my relationship. That unless you live up to this perfect ideal in my mind, then I'm going to prefer my fantasy over God's reality. And that is what breaks down a marriage. That is what breaks down healthy connection. Is where now we are putting our spouse up against our optimal expectations. And that is unfair. And it's a recipe for disaster and disconnection because you are setting them up to fail. So some questions to ask within an argument are, what are some healthy expectations that I have in my relationship? And what are some unhealthy expectations that I have? Am I even aware of my expectations? And have my expectations become idols, or are they advising my connection to build unity? These expectations always lead to triggers. Now, that's a popular word in our day and age, but it's really, really important that we talk about triggers. Because triggers are what hinder us from our optimal expectation. A trigger is something that takes control when I don't have control. This week I experienced a trigger. I was watching a show that I haven't watched in years. And I was really enjoying it. I was watching the show, and there came this episode that I remember watching. I haven't watched it since I was like a teenager. And there came this episode, and within the episode, somebody passes away of leukemia. And there's this music that starts to play, and it just kind of comes in blindsiding you. Like the show seems like it's light and funny, and then all of a sudden, boom, this music starts playing, and it reveals that this person had passed away. I don't know what was happening in my brain, but literally, I went from watching the show laughing to uncontrollable crying. Like, I just started weeping. I literally had to leave the room and go into my bedroom. I just started crying. It was so bizarre that in a moment, something triggered, and I didn't have any control. You guys can hold off for just a second. That's what a trigger does. A trigger takes control when we don't have any. It's something that launches an emotional response, and when we look back at it later on, we're like, how did that happen? But what a trigger does is a trigger takes control when I can't be in control. Now, there's lots of different triggers in our lives. There are action triggers. Rarely is a person a trigger. Now, I know you think that one person is a trigger in your life, but it really has to do with their behavior and their actions and patterns that can be triggers, right? Behaviors, experiences, environments, those can all be triggers. There are sensory triggers, things that we see or hear, but there are also trauma triggers. And I want to talk a little bit about trauma for a second, because as I've been going to counseling for many years, this is something that I've been speaking with my counselor over. I've been going to counseling ever since I was in my 20s, because this is something that's a high value in my life, is to be able to understand my own emotional health so that I can give myself to a healthy relationship. The thing about trauma is that trauma works differently than most experiences that we have in our lives. I want to read to you something out of a website that talks about the psychology of this, to give you a little bit of an understanding about trauma. On the Phoenix Society website, here's what it says. It says, several parts of the brain are important in understanding how the brain and body function during trauma. They include the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, which is located in the center of the brain, and the brainstem. When a person experiences a traumatic event, adrenaline rushes through the body, and the memory is imprinted in the amygdala, which is a part of the limbic system. The amygdala holds the emotional significance of the event, including the intensity and the impulse of emotion. For example, if you're on a roller coaster, your sensory information is fear, speed, stress, excitement, but not life-threatening. The amygdala can read the emotional significance of the event as it's a fun ride, which you'll be off of in 3 minutes. The amygdala stores the visual images of trauma as sensory fragments, which means the trauma memory is not stored like a story, rather by how our 5 senses were experiencing the trauma at the time it occurred. The memories are stored through fragments of visual images, smells, sounds, tastes, or touch. Consequently, after trauma, the brain can easily be triggered by sensory input, reading normal circumstances as dangerous. For example, a red light is no longer a red light. Now it's a possible spark. A barbecue had just been a barbecue, but now it sounds like an explosion. The sensory fragments are misinterpreted, and the brain loses its ability to discriminate between what is threatening and what is normal. Trauma is stored in a different part of your brain that sometimes is only accessed through certain types of sensory experiences. Now, why are we talking about this? It's important because triggers create an emotional urgency that revert us back to our origins. I'm going to say that again. Triggers create an emotional urgency that revert us back to our origins. Sometimes we don't understand our reaction to a trigger because we aren't even aware of what's taking place in our brain. So let me give you a few examples, right? You don't know why you get so crazy angry when your spouse does something that you don't like. But the trigger is bringing you back to a time in your life when you had no control. Have you ever stepped back and asked yourself, why did I get so angry? Like, that's what marriage will do, right? Like, there's a rage that comes out that you just didn't know was there, and you're asking, why did I react that way? But what you're unaware of is that there was a trigger that brought you back to a moment in your life when you had no control. And when you have no control, something rises up in you to try to grab control. You don't know why you shut down emotionally when conflict arises. Some of you, when you get into an argument, you just shut down. And you literally can't control it. And you don't know why you do it. But what's happening is the trigger of whatever is going on within that conflict is bringing you back to a moment where you felt powerless, so you had to disassociate to survive. And now what your body and your brain is doing is shutting down so that you can just survive through the conflict. Just get through it so that you can make it another day. You don't know why you leave the house, why you storm out and exit a conversation when an argument takes place. But the trigger is bringing you back to behavior that you saw modeled, or somewhere in your life you made up your mind that that was the only way to have benefits in your relationship. You see, triggers take control when you don't. And I need you to hear this. This is so important. Nobody is responsible for your triggers except for you. Now, I know that that's hard to hear. And I have the most amount of empathy and understanding because we all have this. I have had this in my own life, trauma in my own life that I've had to work through, that I've gone to counseling to work through. But only me, only I am responsible for those triggers. And most conflict continues in our relationships because we are blaming other people for triggers that only we can address. Now, that doesn't mean that your spouse can be a part of the solution, but it does mean that you need to become aware of what triggers you and why. What just sparks an emotional urgency in you that causes you to flip out, to shut down? Whatever your response is, what is that trigger and why is it? Is it because you watched that in your parents' relationship growing up? Is it that you had sexual abuse when you were a child, and so the only way you know how to survive is to literally shut down and shut out memories in your life? People wonder why abuse victims forget about the experiences that they had. It's because the part of your brain that experiences trauma can suppress and shut these things down to get you to survive, but they will come out in other areas of your relationships. So a few questions you need to ask yourself are, do I own my triggers? Because if you don't take time to tame those triggers, your triggers will tear apart your relationship. It will turn into abuse. It will turn into isolation. It will turn into complete separation in a marriage. You need to own the triggers. Another question is, have I communicated those triggers to my significant other? Because it's one thing to be aware of them. It's another thing to be honest about them. I got to be able to share, hey, this triggers me. And I know we don't like doing that because that makes us vulnerable and it makes us look weak, especially men, right? We don't want to tell our spouses that when you do this, it hurts me, makes me feel insecure. But if you don't communicate that, your spouse can never be a part of helping heal that wound and progress the relationship. And lastly, are you aware of how you are triggering your significant other? We love to talk about our own triggers, but what about the triggers that our partner has? They are still human beings that come from experiences as well. And so we need to be willing to ask those questions. Lastly, we've gone from origins to foundations to expectations to triggers, which ultimately lead us to the last one in the cause of our arguments, and that is what I call controllers. Controllers are how we remove those hindrances that are keeping us from moving forward. If the trigger is the hindrance, the controller is the way we get that hindrance out of the way so we can get to where we want to go. Now, I know you might be saying to yourself, I'm not really a controlling person. Well, newsflash, every person is a controlling person. It's built into the human condition to control. In fact, we all got that part of our DNA in the garden at the fall of man. We all are longing for control. We just all go about it differently. And so although your controlling issues may not seem as blatant as somebody else's, we all are fighting for control in a relationship. So how do you control when you're triggered? There's a couple things that I've written out here that may connect with you. Maybe you didn't think of yourself as a controlling person, but when you're in a conflict, what are the ways that you use to control the situation? Is it through distance? Do you walk away and exit the scene? You convince yourself, well, I'm just not going to give into this conflict. I'm not going to go into it. But what you're really doing is you're setting the conflict on your terms, saying that this is only going to happen when I want it to happen. That's control. Is it through escalation? Raising your voice to exert dominance? That's a form of control. That's a form of suppressing somebody else's voice so that I can get my point across. Is it silence? Because shutting down means shutting them out. They're only going to get from me what I want them to get from me. That's a form of control. Is it vengeance? Using hurtful words to break them down? I think at any point in a marriage, we've all been here before where we've used hurtful words as a way of controlling the conversation. Well, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you back. Is it infidelity? Connecting with somebody else because I can't connect with you? Going to the screen because the real life relationship isn't giving me the intimacy that I'm longing for? Is it dismissal, refusing to engage in the conflict altogether? Manipulation, never admitting fault and somehow reversing the blame every single time? Look, when you're triggered, you're going to take control. The question is, are you taking control of yourself or are you trying to take control of the situation? Now, here's the unfortunate truth. Only one of those actually works. You can really only take control of one of those two options. Because if you try to take control of the situation and you try to take control of somebody else, what's going to happen is you are going to sow the seed of bitterness, resentment, hate, anger, unforgiveness, offense that's only going to deepen the wound of conflict. It'll never heal it. The only thing that you can control within a conflict is you. When we try to control others and not ourselves, conflict becomes destructive. Because controlling others means that I am going to bypass you to get to the preference, to my preference, to my expectation. But controlling self, which is actually a fruit of the Spirit, self-control, Galatians tells us, is a product of the Spirit of God in our lives. What this does is it says, I am going to choose to put me on the altar here so that we can work towards the purpose. It's not just about my preferences, it's about the purpose. And so here are some questions to ask in an argument. How do I take control when I'm in conflict? What are the things that I do to try to grab control? Because we're all longing for control. And might I suggest that the best way to solve a conflict is to be somebody that actually empowers the other person in a conversation instead of strips it from them. If I am focused on trying to gain all the control and all of the dominance in the argument, then I strip the other person of their voice. That only leads to more disconnection. But if I'm a person that empowers and says, you know what, I need to hear where you're coming from. I need to understand your perspective. I need to know why you're triggered right now. Speak. Let me hear from your understanding what's going on. I'm a person that gives control. And when I give control, I empower connection. I lead by example. But we need to ask, are we taking control of ourselves or others in the midst of conflict? Using guilt is a form of control. Manipulation, all of these things, you know the right, come on spouses, you know the right thing to say, to get right under there. That's a form of control. And it's ungodly and it's unhealthy and it doesn't build trust. Because if every single time we get in a conflict, you're gonna throw something at me or I'm gonna break you down, you know what's gonna happen? Either we're gonna escalate the conflict or I'm never going to be willing to enter into it with you for fear of being hurt and wounded by the person that's closest to me. Lastly, how can I start controlling me to make conflict constructive? I want to challenge us in week 1 of this message of the anatomy of an argument to really do some homework this week and to take ourselves and get some time to contemplate and to be introspective about some of these things. Maybe you need to list out the 5 things that I just talked about, your origins, your foundations, your expectations, what triggers you and how you try to take control. Maybe in your relationship, you need to come together at some point in the week and share what you've discovered about yourself. I believe it will bring intimacy and connection. But we can't talk about how to adjust the course of conflict until we understand the cause of it. And ultimately, the greatest cause of conflict is when my preferences are greater than the purpose of why God joined us together in the first place. Marriage and relationships are not simply there to make you happy. They're there to challenge and expose the ugly in you, to sanctify you and make you more like Christ. I want to encourage somebody that's watching right now and you've been wondering if you married the right person. You've been wondering if this is the right relationship for you because there's been arguments and conflict and it's gotten out of hand. And I want to encourage you that if your relationship is bringing up conflict and exposing ugly in you, chances are it's a gift from God. It's a gift from God to help you become the person that He always intended you to be. But listen to me, both people need to be committed to the purpose of selflessness and love that looks like Christ for a marriage and relationship to work. It requires both people. And I know you're looking at your spouse right now, expecting them to be the one to start it. Outlove your spouse. Outserve your spouse. Be the first to take the step towards restoration and reconciliation. Don't wait for them to apologize to you. You apologize to them. Don't wait for them to go give you a hug and say they're sorry. You go ahead and embrace them first. Don't wait for them to break down their ego and their pride. You be the one to take the step of leadership in your marriage. Say, I'm going to love like Christ. I'm going to lay it all down so that I can lead like Jesus and bring us to a place of unity.